Sometimes these programs for surveillance are brought in under words like student well-being or student support, but it adds up to a new surveillance regime. Instead, it makes students who already feel like they are overburdened by surveillance and punishment feel even less part of the community. I'm Catherine Squires. I'm a writer, editor, researcher, and yoga teacher, and I am one of the speakers at Data for Public Good. I came to the Data for Public Good conference to be on a panel where we were presenting the results of a nationwide survey of students and parents about how COVID-19 impacted the use of technology, and particularly surveillance technology, in online learning. I was invited by Marika Pfefferkorn as part of her work with the Midwest Center for School Transformation and Dignity in Schools campaign to help analyze the data that had been collected by the community researchers for the Dignity in Schools campaign. So we looked at the survey results as well as the information from the focus groups and interviews to analyze how parents and students experience things like technological difficulties or accessing technology while they were trying to navigate the world of online learning in the wake of the COVID shutdown. I think this is a really important thing for everyone to be thinking about, the way that technology is ramping up in schools, particularly surveillance technologies. Many companies are promising to help keep kids safe or even address the spike in depression and other mental health challenges that we're seeing in young people these days. But there's actually no evidence that the kinds of surveillance technology that they say will flag problematic behavior or cries for help actually prevents any of the things that they say they can prevent. Instead, it makes students who already feel like they are overburdened by surveillance and punishment feel even less part of the community. Because in the United States, school districts are locally controlled, there isn't a lot of data yet on how many schools are using surveillance software like Gaggle or Sentinel, or one that's even called Bark, as if there's a guard dog in the school watching when kids are using social media when they're not supposed to, or something like this. But in our survey, which covered 29 states and had over 500 respondents, we found that 77% reported that their school was using some kind of surveillance technology to monitor student behavior and activity online. It's not surprising to me that so many students and parents reported that this kind of technology was being used in their schools. Unfortunately, since the spikes in school shootings and the wave of mental health problems that many students have faced in the last 10 years, many school districts are turning to technology as a cheap way, quite frankly, to try to mitigate harm and also to give parents a sense that they're doing everything they can to protect students. But even some of the companies that sell cameras and facial recognition software to schools admit these things don't stop that kind of violence, because you actually have to know the person and their face in order to screen them from coming into the school. And what we know is that, unfortunately, most school shooters are from the community. They're not outsiders who already have a criminal record or a history of gun violence. And so these tools are probably giving people a false sense of security and safety, whereas building better relationships between students and the adults in the schools and the adults in their lives and their school could help with the communication that might actually help people identify a student who's struggling before they go down a dangerous path. One thing that I'd like people to take away from our study is not only how prevalent these technologies are, but how little people know what is happening with their students' data and who else might be brought into the dragnet. So for example, if a student has a program like Gaggle being used for the work they're doing at school, for their social media messages, that monitoring that's happening on their school device, if they bring that school device home Or if they log into the school system, maybe using a sibling's device or their parent's device, let's say they ran out of battery power and forgot their charger in their locker. Well, if they log in on their mom or dad's computer using the school system, now mom and dad's computer is being monitored. And so it's a much wider set of people who are getting their information taken without their knowledge. And so it's really important for parents and students and advocates to ask school systems, to ask districts, principals, the people who do procurement, to be transparent in the kinds of contracts that they are signing with these third-party companies, and to give much more information up front of what students are actually giving consent to when they say, I promise to use this device that the school gives me, because they are probably having much more surveillance happening, not just at school, but also in their home. So we didn't cover in this study who are the decision makers, but we do have evidence from some Freedom of Information Act investigations and the 74, which is an education online magazine that's been doing a lot of investigative work on the way surveillance is invading schools, that it's usually at the district level or the Department of Education level. But again, in the United States, school districts are so decentralized. Our whole educational system is decentralized. And so what one district is doing in Ramsey County, whereas where we are, and what something is happening in Hennepin might be completely different. So for example, Minneapolis Public Schools used Gaggle. St. Paul Public Schools didn't. So even just a city next door could be completely different depending on what the school board, the superintendent, and other people decide to use with different kinds of grants they get for student well-being. And indeed, with the Gaggle case, it was money that was provided during COVID to try to support students that was used to create the contract with Gaggle. If people want to see the findings from this report, we're finishing up the recommendations that are coming out of it, and it will be available on the Dignity in Schools campaign website in a few weeks. It's really important for people to be thinking about these issues at a time when schools, like hospitals, are becoming more and more targeted by folks who are trying to do things like data ransom. So unfortunately, Minneapolis Public Schools was the target of a ransomware attack, and they were able to get student records. Some of those student records included the ways that students were being flagged by Gaggle and the documents that were flagged. So this can include anything from a message between classmates to a school assignment or a journal reflection, so personal information was available, and to the point where some of the things that were released after the district refused to pay the ransom identified students. And so these companies, because they're able to use proprietary information and other veils to say exactly what they've got, what they store, how they store it, how long they store it, your data could be vulnerable. And again, people in your house, their data could be vulnerable too if the student is logging in on a different device. And then if a ransomware attack happens or some other data leak happens, then it could expose many, many more people than just the student. So these things we don't like to think about because we hope that it won't happen, but more and more schools are getting targeted by bad actors who know that they don't have the kind of money to pay for security systems, or they're using third parties, and that's a backdoor to get into their data. Some people might be familiar with the FERPA regulations, which is supposed to protect student and family data when a student is in school, all the way up through college. But if you actually look at the court cases when people have felt their FERPA rights were violated, there's never ever been a case where a school district, or even a Department of Education had to pay any damages for that being done. So there are many, many loopholes that allow law enforcement and other actors to get access to student data, and I don't think people understand that enough, that FERPA regulations don't protect you, and they were written at a time when we didn't have all the different kinds of of electronic devices and data and cameras that we have in schools now. So it really needs to be updated and strengthened if people want to have the kinds of privacy protections that they deserve. If people are concerned and want to find out what is actually happening in their schools, I would argue they probably need to ask multiple people in different roles at the school. Sometimes these programs for surveillance are brought in under words like student well-being or student support, but it adds up to a new surveillance regime. It's quite likely your student's teacher does not understand or even know about the scope of the surveillance that might be happening in the school because they may not have been briefed on it or they may not have heard the whole story. For example, we know that many teachers in Minneapolis public schools didn't know that Gaggle had been implemented or to what extent it was able to surveil students beyond the school day. In fact, most of the red flags that happened with the Gaggle system happened after school hours. So if you don't get an answer from a teacher, go to an administrator and school board members. You also might make a request, a Freedom of Information request of the Department of Education or your local school board, because some of those contracts are never going to be in a simple, easy place to find online. And sometimes things can be decided in a consent decree or consent agenda in a board meeting, which means they're not actually aired for debate. So the paper trail could be very hard to follow. And so asking lots of questions of different people and hopefully with other parents and concerned community members so you can share the burden and not have to do it all by yourself. I'm inspired to do this work because I was brought into it in the early 2000s when I met Marika Pfefferkorn when she was working on the school to prison pipeline. And then when they shifted that emphasis to the school to prison algorithms, seeing the ways that these new computing programs and big data were being used to predict students failing, predict students becoming criminals, she realized that the scope of the work had to shift. And as a mother of a student with special needs, I know how much more of a burden is on those kinds of students as well as Black and brown students when they're at school and they are being surveilled more than their white peers. So I have a personal stake in building a better way of supporting students without just resorting to data-rich programs that actually replicate so many of the biases that already exist in our school systems. A better future for our schools, for me, starts with the students and the people who care about them getting together and having time to dream about what a truly supportive, enriching school environment looks and feels like, and designing it from the ground up. Because we know that so many of our school systems are struggling, as well as not coming up with ideas on how to fix the problems that have plagued them for so long. And I believe in public schools. I come from the public school system. I taught in public universities for over 20 years, and I know how important education is. And I really want the people who are most impacted to be at the center of designing those futures. And that's what this conference is really all about.